We're going to be continuing today with the study on covenants, part 2. As I mentioned, I'm taking it a bit slower than we went through it at college, and we can at least go into some detail and some of the things that we went through very quickly there. And just a brief recap, we saw that a covenant is a legally enforceable agreement between two or more parties to do or to refrain from doing a certain act. And we saw that it was the equivalent in today's term of today's world of a contract, a deal, pact, agreement, treaty, alliance, a testament, or a last will. And in the Bible, this term covenant has always been used and has always been a crucial part of God's relationship with his people. This legal concept has been used because people understand the idea of a covenant whereby two or more parties swear and they enter into agreement and they make an oath in order to keep certain terms. And we saw that there were covenants which were royal grants, where they were unconditional, where God just gave a royal grant to the likes of David and Abraham. And there were covenants where there were terms and conditions, like the covenant that was made at Sinai with the people of Israel. Now, covenant of PARITY was a voluntary agreement we saw between equals. It was a conditional covenant, and it bound them to mutual friendship, or at least to mutual respect for each other's spheres and interests. And in those covenants, the terms that they would use to address each other would be brothers. And you find that in the suzerain vassal covenant, we saw that that was between a king and either a lesser king or a vassal. And there the terms would rather be father and son, or a reference to a servant. But yeah, in this covenant of PARITY, they called each other brothers. And so Abram and Abimelech made a covenant of PARITY. We read in Genesis chapter 21. And because they're equals, they negotiate the terms. And in return for getting property rights for a well in Beersheba, we find that Abraham promises to be kind to Abimelech and his offspring. Now, the name Abimelech, in Hebrew, it's actually ABIMELECH. And if you know anything about Hebrew, you'll know that Avi means father and Melech is a king. So it's probably more a title. And that's why you'll find that the same term appears later with Isaac, and he also meets with Abimelech, but the time scale seems to be too long for it to be the same person. So it appears just as the title that the Philistine rulers used for their king, father king. And likewise, his commander of his army, Pichol, also probably is just a title because it means great, the commander of the army. And so Abimelech, or Abimelech, as we say in English, and Pichol, it says the commander of his army said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. It's interesting to see that they noted that the blessing of God was on Abraham's life. And I want to ask you, do others see the hand of God in your life? Can people look at you and say the same thing, that God is with you in all that you do? They saw how Abraham was blessed of God. It says in Proverbs 16 verse 7, when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies live at peace with him. And we're seeing both the case of Abraham and Isaac. The Philistines were even then a bit of a thorn in the flesh, and yet they keep coming and asking for treaties. And so Genesis 21, 23 to 24, we find that Abimelech says, now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I've dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abram said, I will swear. Then Abram complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard about it only today. If you read the book of Genesis, you find that what happened is there was a famine, and so Abram had gone down into the domain that was ruled by Abimelech. And the king gave him free grazing rights to whatever land he wanted. But it seems that later on, this promise had been violated by some of Abimelech's own servants. Abram had dug a well and they had laid claim to the well. And so now that they're about to enter into a covenant, Abram mentions his grievance. They want a covenant with him and he says, but your guys have swapped one of the wells that I've dug. And it appears, if we're to believe Abimelech, that he was unaware of the incident. And so that's something to bear in mind, folks. Sometimes it's good to raise issues. The problem might be due to ignorance rather than malice. Sometimes we always attribute bad motives to people, but it may just be, as in the case here, where Abimelech said, I didn't even know about this. Why didn't you tell me about it? And so when he hears of the complaint, he enters into a covenant with Abram and he acknowledges Abram's right to the well and hence his continued business activity in the region. These guys were shepherds, they had flocks. It was crucial to them that they had a good water supply. Couldn't survive without it. If you didn't have a good well, you had to move on and find another place where there was water. Now we see in the earlier case, when Abram divides the land with his nephew Lot, he gave up what was rightfully his to keep. Remember, he gave Lot the first option. He said, you choose, because there again, the herdsmen were arguing over the land. And so Abram allowed Lot to choose. And Lot chose the better portion. Yet here we find in this case that Abram seems to protect what is his. And it doesn't appear that Abram is wavering in his faith, because the account ends with worship. We'll see with Abram worshiping God. So it seems here that Abram is a model of a wise and a hard-working businessman. He conducts his business openly. He makes fair use of appropriate legal protections. He'd been promised by Abimelech that he could have, free access to whatever land he wanted to. And Abram wouldn't have been able to provide for his animals and his workers and his families without access to that well. And so what is the modern application? Remember, in all these things, we need to look how we can apply it to our modern day life. And we find that in every kind of work, we too have to make discernment. Sometimes in the case like Lot, Abram made an allowance and he gave him, what was rightfully his. Yet, in this case, he wants access to this well. And we have to discern when to act generously to benefit others and when to protect the resources and rights for ourselves. It's the same with us. We sometimes also find we have many people at the church who come and ask for assistance and help. And you have to use discernment. Sometimes there people are to take advantage and just to tell lies in order to steal, to benefit themselves. Other times there's genuine need, and I'm sure you all face these sort of situations. And we have to be good stewards of God's resources. It's not always clear whether God's purposes are better served by giving away resources or by protecting them. And so we see in the case of Abram, there are cases, and we need to decide in consultation with God on a case-by-case basis. It's not only a matter of who's in the right, but how the decision will affect our relationships with those around us. So in the case of Lot, Abram obviously decides that in order to have a good long-term relationship, working relationship with his nephew, it would be better to give him the choice. And so that's what he does. In this case, Abram, when they're about to negotiate the contract, ensures that the resource that he needs to keep his business going remains under his control. And in fact, it actually seems that Abram's assertiveness in this case actually improved relationships between himself and Abimelech. If you know anything about the story, you'll find that initially they didn't have a very good relationship because Abram didn't assert his position. When he first came into the territory, he was afraid that they were going to take his wife, and so he told a half lie. She was his half-sister, but he claimed that she was his sister because he was scared they were going to kill him to take his wife. And it ended up in a problem. And in this case, Abram rather is truthful and he lets him know that he has a grievance and they sort it out. Something we can learn for our own lives. And so Genesis 21 verse 27, it says that Abram took sheep and oxen and he gave them to Abimelech. and the two men made a covenant. Now, if you recall, I told you that although we translate that in English, made a covenant to make sense, it's actually cut a covenant. That wouldn't make sense in our culture, but that's literally what it was. They cut a covenant. And the reason was it always involved some sort of blood sacrifice. The slaughter and the cutting of animals indicated that each person who was entering this covenant was promising to give their own life in order to keep its terms. They were swearing on their life. It was a blood covenant, something that was viewed very seriously. To break a covenant was to invite your own death as a penalty. And so there's no more serious relationship than those that are commitment, where you are committing your life itself. And that's why it's interesting that these are the kind of terms that God uses when he's dealing with us. That God is saying he's prepared to prove his devotion to us by offering his own life. Now, obviously, in the case of God, God cannot die, but yet we find that Jesus, when he became a man, he not only was prepared to offer his own life, he was prepared to offer his life for the fault we made on the covenant. We had defaulted on the covenant with God, and he was prepared to pay the price for the covenant failure of human beings with whom he was in relationship. Isn't that amazing to think of that? The kind of covenants that God makes with us exceed the limits of the human covenant-making practices. Then it says that Abram set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was named Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. Now, we might not see the significance in the translation, but in the Hebrew, 7 is actually shavah, and an oath is also shavah, very similar. And so Be'er Shavah actually means the oath, the well of the oath, or the well of the 7. It means both. The well of the 7, referring to the lambs that were sacrificed as part of the covenant, or the well of the oath, Be'er Shavah. And again, if we want to look at an application into the modern or the new covenant that we have, there were 7 lambs that sealed the covenant between Abraham and Isaac. But it was one spotless lamb named Jesus who forever sealed God's covenant with his people as well. God also had a lamb, and that lamb was, as John the Baptist said when he saw Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so when God looks at Jesus, he remembers his covenant with mankind as well. If we go a bit later in the book of Genesis, we find that Isaac enters into a covenant with a man called Abimelech. But remember, it's probably not the same guy. There's a slight possibility it could be him, but he would have been very old if you work out the distance in years. And that's why we believe that it's a title. He was the king of the Philistines. And possibly he was even the son of Abram's counterpart. Now, Isaac also moved to their territory because of a famine, interestingly enough. There's a lot of parallels with his father's story. And initially, they were very friendly to him. And Abimelech ordered his people, anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Interestingly, Isaac also lied about his wife being his sister as well. But they kind of figured out it wasn't his sister because they saw the two together and they noted that they were very cozy together. And they realized he was telling a lie as well. So he had the same failing as his father. He was a bit worried about. It seems that in those days, they used to like passing off their wife as their sister because they were scared they won't get killed for that. But Isaac settles down in their territory and God prospers him. And very similar to our modern times, we see it in South Africa, when a foreigner prospers, the local people get resentful. And you see that when you have people who come from another country and maybe their business does well, or maybe they bought a nice car, we find that the local people are resentful. And we have the truck drivers at the moment who complaining because they're employing people, drivers from overseas, and they want to protest about it. And things haven't changed much, because it says here, Isaac planted crops in the land and the same year reaped 100-fold. He's just arrived because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. Here's a foreigner, and why is he doing better than me? He's not allowed to. And so we find that the relationship deteriorates. We're told that some of the wells that Abram had dug, that Isaac was using, the Philistines actually went and filled them up with earth. So it was just being spiteful. They didn't even take them, they just filled them up. And then Abimelech eventually says to Isaac, move away from us. You've become too powerful for us. And so Isaac moves away and he settles down. And it says he reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died. And it says that his servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water. But what happens is, the Philistines, the herdsmen from Gerar, they quarrel and they say, no, that's our well. The water's ours. And so he named the well Esek because they disputed with him. And what Isaac does, he doesn't fight about it. He just moves on. He moves elsewhere. And he's meant to dig another well. But you know what happens? The Philistines come along and they say, no, that one's ours as well. And they quarrel about it. And what does Isaac do? He's clearly a man of peace because he moves on. And he goes to a third place. And he digs another well, and eventually no one quarrels about it. And so he names that well Rehoboth, saying it means room. Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land. So Isaac, as a peacemaker, rather than engage in conflict and demand his rights, he simply moves on, and eventually God grants him respite and still blesses him. And so it's in that context that Abimelech, who was initially hostile to him, remember they told him to leave, and the guys had been filling up all his wells or swiping them, they decide they want to enter into a covenant with him, promising mutual respect. And so we read in Genesis 26, verse 23. From there, he went to Beersheba. Remember, Beersheba was the place where Abram had made the covenant years back with the Philistines as well, with a man also called Abimelech. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahazath, his advisor, and Pichol, the commander of his army, Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me away from you? What's up, guys? I thought you hated me. They said, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. There again, like his father, they could see the hand of God in his life, the blessing of God. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm. That's interesting. They want a covenant that he won't harm them, but they've been the guys who've been stealing all his property and filling up his wells and telling him to leave. And they want a covenant that he's not going to want revenge. Obviously, in their minds, if they'd been treated that way, they'd want revenge. So let's make a covenant that you're not going to hurt us. Just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good. Okay, well, that might be questionable. And have sent you away in peace. And you find that still Isaac, this man of peace, rather than saying, well, actually, on the contrary, you filled up my wells and swiped the wells that I dug, it says he made them a feast. And they ate and drank. And in the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths. Now, Isaac would be the forefather, obviously, of the Israelites. And Abimelech was an early Philistine. And if you know your Bible, you don't have to know too well to know that later on those two nations would become bitter enemies. If you read the book of Judges and Samuel, you find that the likes of Goliath and, the Philistines were always a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites. But here, Isaac, as a man of peace, is able to at least negotiate a covenant that lasts for at least some time. And it's only in later years that they would enter this terrible rivalry that they had. And this is to Isaac's credit, and we can learn from him as well. Even after he's mistreated multiple times, remember his wells that he had dug had been filled or else stolen. Then he was asked to leave their territory, and yet despite that, he enters into a covenant of peace with the Philistines and says he will do no harm to them. And that speaks to me of the covenant again we have with God. We were God's enemies. We also did many things that were displeasing to God. We broke his laws, his commandments. And yet it says in Romans 5 verse 10, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son. Despite the fact that we had offended God and were enemies, he initiated a covenant of peace with us. And the last covenant I want to mention today, we'll look at some more next time, is a covenant between Rahab and the spies of Israel. It was made when the Israelites, who had been led by Joshua, were entering the land of Canaan. Remember, they had left Egypt. They'd been in the wilderness for 40 years. And they were now approaching Israel, not from the southern part, if you know Israel. They'd come around and they were entering today what is called Jordan. If you have a look at the map there. They didn't come up from the bottom. They came around from Jordan's side. And they were at the point of crossing the Jordan into the city of Jericho. Jericho was their first designated target for conquest when they crossed the Jordan. That's why they crossed the Jordan, in case you've ever wondered about that. And so we see that Joshua sends 2 spies into the land, and he tells them, go look over the land, especially Jericho, because Jericho is the target. A well-known Bible story that we're reading over here. And so we find that they go into Jericho, and it says that they enter the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. And the king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. And so the king sends this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they've come to spy out the whole land. So we find the king has got a good secret service going. They know that they've been infiltrated and they want to get these spies. But Rahab says, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. And so she sends them off on a wild goose chase. But we are told that actually she had taken them up onto the roof and she had hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. And so before the spies lay down for the night, she comes up onto the roof and says to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land. Not too sure how she had this knowledge of God, because she's talking obviously of Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, and she seems to have reverence for God. She says, we've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So she acknowledges the supremacy of God. And then she requests from them a covenant of mercy. And so we see this is why she was commended, we'll find in the New Testament, for her faith. She has faith that God is going to give Canaan into the hands of the Israelites. And she says, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I've shown kindness to you. So she's asking for a covenant. They have to swear to her. And so the men say, our lives for our lives. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. And so she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. And the men tell her, this oath will not be binding unless you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought all your family into your house. So there's conditions to the covenant. And the covenant sign is this scarlet cord. They say you need to hang this out of the window so everybody knows that's the house. And also you need to make sure that your family are with you. Otherwise we are released of our promises. And she says, agreed, let it be as you say. And so she sent them away and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went, and we find that they hide out for 3 days until their pursuers have searched for them along the road and returned without finding them. And the men go back, and they eventually arrive back at the camp of the Israelites, and they report back to Joshua, and they tell them everything that had happened, and they say, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us. And we find that they were true to their promise, this covenant that they entered in. When the city fell, remember, you must know the story, how they marched around the city 7 days, and on the 7th day, they marched around 7 times and blew the trumpets, and how the wall came down. The walls came down, and Joshua says to these 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with the oath, your oath to her. So she made this covenant. And because of this covenant and because of the scarlet cord, which was a sign of it, she and her family were spared. And so it says that the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab. Her father, her mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. So this woman, through her foresight, through her faith that God was going to give the victory to Israel, was able to save not only her life, but the life of all her family. And I'm sure you're probably pretty aware of the significance of the scarlet cord. Remember scarlet, the color of blood? In return for offering the spies protection, she negotiated this covenant for herself and her family's protection. And when they saw the scarlet cord, that was the sign. They knew that there was a covenant with her. And that symbolized the promise of protection. And it has been seen as typical, the blood of Christ in the New Testament. When God sees the scarlet cord, the blood of Jesus in our lives, we are also protected from God's righteous anger. A beautiful type that we see over there. And so this woman, this former harlot, is commended as one of the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11 verse 31. And God will spare our lives as well when he sees the blood of Jesus. That's what we remember when we read the story of Rahab. It says in Romans 5 verse 10, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son. It's the blood of Jesus that is our covenant sign, protection from God's wrath, and we spared from the coming judgment of God. We also looked in our previous study how in a suzerain vassal covenant, remember suzerain just means a king, the greater king would offer protection to the lesser party. And so too, just as Rahab was given protection in a suzerain vassal covenant, the king who was more powerful would offer to protect the lesser party if they were in danger. And we too have this promise of protection from God. In Psalm 74, verse 19 to 21, I like this because it talks about our protection with regards to the covenant. Do not hand over the life of your dove to wild beasts. Do not forget the lives of your afflicted people forever. Have regard for your covenant, because haunts of violence fill the dark places of the land. Do not let the oppressed retreat in disgrace. May the poor and needy praise your name. Covenant that we have with God, we have protection from a great king. There is no greater. Now, what's interesting, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this, many people are aware of the role of Ruth in the lineage of Jesus. But did you know that Rahab is mentioned in Matthew as being the wife of a man called Salmon, who was the father of Boaz? What does that mean? It means that this woman, Rahab, was the mother of Boaz and the mother-in-law of Ruth. Interesting. A relationship that not many people are aware of. So she is not only the mother of Boaz and the mother-in-law of Ruth, she becomes one of the forerunners of David. She is the great-great-grandmother of David. This former harlot, prostitute, who covenants with the people of God, became an ancestor of the Messiah because of her faith, because of the trust that she put in, because of the covenant that she entered into with him that saved her life, and ultimately would be one of the forerunners of Jesus. I find it very interesting, in fact, when you read Jesus' genealogy in the book of Matthew. In the patriarchal society, not much mention was always made of the woman, and so they had more interest in tracing the lineage through the man. But there are 5 women that are mentioned there, and the 5 women that are mentioned is Tamar, Rahab and Ruth, Bathsheba and Mary. And all of those 5 had somewhat of a tainted reputation, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. Tamar, if you read in the Old Testament, pretended to be a prostitute in order to seduce her father-in-law. I won't go into the details of the story. Rahab was a former Canaanite prostitute. Ruth, although she seems to have a nice character, she was, according to the Israelites, she was part of an accursed people. The Moabites were accursed. Bathsheba was an adulteress, and Mary was a suspected adulteress, although unfairly the people thought that she was an adulteress. And at least 2 of those 5, Ruth and Rahab, were Gentiles. Rahab, we see, was a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabitess. And possibly Bathsheba was also Gentile because she was married to Uriah, who we're told was a Hittite. Now, the Hittites were part of the Canaanites. Isn't it amazing? Now, here's the genealogy of Jesus. You'd think they'd want to mention there must have been plenty of good character, prominent women that they could have mentioned, and these are the women that are chosen to be mentioned. Why not rather list women who are known and honored as virtuous Israelites? And that is because God places value in the people that men despise and reject. He can use anyone to accomplish his purposes, and he often chooses the despised and the humble. Remember, Jesus chose the place where he was born. He could have chosen his lineage, and yet this is the type of line he chose to come from. In 1 Corinthians 1, verse 26 to 29, Paul says, "Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise." He says that God has chosen the foolish things, he's chosen the weak things, he's chosen the lowly things and the despised things and the things that are not. And so today, when we stand before God, we realize that God places value in us. No matter what your background, no matter what people you come from, no matter what your level of education, no matter how much money you've got in the bank, God values you and you're important to him and he can use you. Just as he could use this woman who was a prostitute to protect those 2 spies of Israel and to assist them in their mission. I just want to look at a few more things about the covenants that we find in the Middle East. Firstly, the covenant clothing. In particular, I want to tell you a bit about sandals. You know anything about sandals in covenants? Don't use them in modern treaties. But if you read the book of Ruth, remember Ruth, now you know, she was the daughter-in-law of Rahab. And before she became the daughter-in-law of Rahab, remember she had initially been married to Mahlon, who was the son of Naomi, and her first husband had died while they were in Moab. And the closest relative, the kinsman redeemer of Ruth's late husband, had the right to redeem the property that belonged to Elimelech. And he had the right also, he could marry Ruth. And this man chose not to do this. We find that Boaz approaches him. He lets him know that he has the right of first refusal because he's the closest relative. It seems that the man's interested in the property, but when he hears that it's a package deal and he has to marry Ruth as well, I'm not too sure. He gives some other reason. Maybe it was because she was a Moabitess and they didn't like them. And so he said, no, sorry, I'm not interested. And to show the covenant, the sign that, of that covenant was he has to give his sandal to Boaz to show that he's agreed now that Boaz can redeem the property and he can marry Ruth. Interesting way. So instead of a contract, their contract was a sandal. And so the covenant is ratified by the one party giving the other party one of his sandals. Let's just read it. Ruth 4, verse 7 to 8. It says, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and the transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. So that was the sign of their contract, the sandal. Later on, we read about David. Remember, David now also descended through this lineage. And he enters into a covenant with Jonathan. And Jonathan goes even further. Jonathan actually gives David his clothing and even his weapons as a sign of their covenant. He doesn't just take his sandal. So 1 Samuel 18, verse 3 to 4, it says, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, if you don't realize how significant that is, remember Jonathan at that time was the prince. He was the son of the king. David, we remember him for his mighty deeds, but he was a shepherd at the time. So yeah, you have a guy who was a shepherd, probably didn't have very fancy clothes, and yeah, this prince gives him his clothes. He gives him his weapons. The weapons of a prince are given to this shepherd boy because of this covenant. So when people saw David dressed in this really nice gear and good armor, they would know that he was in covenant with the prince. Jonathan demonstrates his commitment by giving David his royal robe. In a symbolic sense, especially as the practice was understood in ancient times in the context of a covenant, David is putting on Jonathan. David is taking on the identity of his covenant partner, Jonathan. We actually have an Akkadian document from an area that's also in that same region, Ugarit, where a 13th century king of Ugarit makes a divorce settlement with his queen. And the couple's son, who's the crown prince, may go with his mother if he wants to. But in that case, he will abdicate his right to the throne. And you know how he showed what his decision would be? If he was going to abdicate his right to the throne by going with the divorced mother, he had to leave his clothes on the throne. And that would be the sign that he was abdicating his throne. So isn't this interesting? Jonathan, who actually was at that time seen as being the heir to the throne, he gives his royal garments to David, recognizing the fact that David is going to be the next ruler. He surrenders his self-interests for his covenant partner. And so the Old Testament contains no finer example of what it means to be a friend. Rather than being envious of David like his father was and trying to kill him, yeah, this man who he should have seen as competition and a threat, he says, well, let me give you the clothes in the meantime, and here's my sword and my armor. Jonathan also stripped himself of his robe and gave it to David, as well as his war coat or armor, his sword, bow, and belt. All of this was both significant and surprising. Significant because the clothes signify the person and his position. Hence, Jonathan renounces his position as crown prince and transfers, so far as his own will goes, the right of succession to David. What a powerful symbol. Jonathan, the king's son, stands humbly in his undergarment, while the shepherd boy dons the prince's robe and armament. Jonathan's act was one of honor, equality, and vulnerability. To wear the robe of a king was an immense honor. Remember in the book of Esther, that was Haman's big desire. He wanted to be able to ride through the street wearing the king's robe. Got into a lot of trouble because it actually turned out the king wanted that honor to be bestowed on Mordecai, but it was seen as a great honor. And when David was seen in those garments, it was a great honor. Jonathan's symbolic divestiture formally abolished David's status as a shepherd and placed him side by side as an equal. His disrobing was a conscious display of vulnerability and real risk. So when you wore the clothing of another covenant party, it meant you were taking on their identity. And isn't it beautiful as well that when Jesus comes into covenant relationship with us, he lays aside his royalty, he takes on our identity, and he's clothed in flesh. He identifies with us. It says in Philippians 2 that Jesus was in very nature God, but he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And it says he was found in appearance as a man. Hebrews chapter 2 says something similar. It says the one who makes people holy, that's Jesus, and the ones who are made holy, that's us, are of the same family. That's why Jesus became a man. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity. And so if you just look at a bit of a comparison there between the covenant that Jonathan enters into with David and Jesus enters into with us, who initiates the covenant? Jonathan initiates the covenant with David. And in the same way, Jesus, the greater party, initiates the covenant with us. What is the motive? In both cases, we find that the motive is love. It says Jonathan loved David, and so Jesus loved us. What is the heart attitude? Jonathan is humble. Even though he's a prince, he's a humble prince. And so Jesus, who is in nature God, is humble. What happens to the identity? David benefits and he effectively puts on Jonathan. And so we find in Galatians 3 verse 27 that believers put on Christ. What happens to rights? Jonathan gave up his rights to the throne. And we've just read how Jesus gave up his right, his demand to be God. He laid down those rights in order to become a man and to enter into covenant relationship with us and redeem us. Just as David, a humble shepherd, gets to wear the robes of royalty because of the covenant love of Jonathan, likewise, we also get to bear the name of Christ. We are called Christians. We carry the name of Christ, and that is an honor, that is a privilege. 1 Peter 4 verse 17, he says, if you suffer as a Christian, so even if as a Christian you suffer, Peter says, don't be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. What a name we have to bear because of our covenant relationship. We carry the name of Christ. We've been identified with him in our covenant. As covenant partners with Jesus, what is our responsibility because of our new clothes, so to speak, and our new identity? We need to live in such a way that others see Christ's life, not ours. So Galatians 2 verse 20, it says, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Christ in you, the hope of glory, Colossians 1 verse 27. Christ, who is your life, it says in Colossians 3 and verse 4. And so we are told in Colossians 1 and verse 10 that we must walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, our covenant partner. We bear his name. We wear in the clothes. We have the name of Christ. Finally, I want to look at the covenant salt. Interesting thing today, especially because we just think of salt as something that we put in our food to make it taste nice. We know that in older days it had a lot more purposes, particularly as a preservative, but it was actually also used in covenants. Did you know that? It's mentioned a few times in the Bible with regard to covenants. It was a very precious commodity. That's in fact where we got our word salary from, by the way, from the Latin word, the Romans spoke Latin for salt. That's where salary came from. Go check it out. And so the Bible refers to a covenant of salt, if you didn't know, and the salt of the covenant. Leviticus 2 verse 13 says, season all your grain offerings with salt. Why? Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. It was a sign of what they called a salt covenant. According to the New Oxford Annotated Bible, this reference to salt was because it was to show that the covenant was a perpetual covenant, because salt was used as a preservative to make things last longer. And so a covenant of salt was something that was seen to be something that was perpetual or everlasting or long-lasting. And we can see it in the context that it's used. Listen to these two references. When God establishes a covenant with Aaron, now this is separate to the covenant with the Israelites. He enters into a priestly covenant of salt with Aaron. And he says in Numbers 18 verse 19, whatever is set aside from the holy offerings the Israelites present to the Lord, I give to you and your sons and daughters, this is to Aaron, as your perpetual share. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord. So a covenant of salt was something that was perpetual, everlasting. When God enters into a covenant with David, remember that a descendant of David will always sit on the throne, covenant that was fulfilled in Jesus. At the moment, he's sitting on the throne in heaven and we fulfilled literally on earth during the millennium. 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5, don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt. So whenever it speaks of a covenant of salt, it speaks about a covenant that is everlasting. And that is the kind of covenant that God has entered into with us. A covenant that's everlasting, forever. God's not going to change the terms later. He's not going to back out and say, well, I made a mistake. It is a covenant of salt. It is enduring. But you know, there's another reason why the term covenant of salt is used. And it's not just to show that the covenant is perpetual. It actually also demonstrates that it's a friendly covenant. There's a Middle Eastern saying, there is bread and salt between us. And that is just a way of saying that there was a relationship that had been confirmed by sharing a meal. If you shared a meal with someone, they were friends. You don't generally have friends with your, meals with your enemies. And so if they said there's bread and salt between us, they were saying that's my friend. When men ate together, they became friends. There's also an Arabic expression. There is salt between us. He has eaten of my salt, which means partaking of hospitality, which cemented friendship. Ezra 4 verse 14, it says, eat the salt of the palace. In some versions, okay, because that's the literal reading. You'll find some, when I looked it up, I found that a lot of the English translations put it a bit differently to make sense to us. But the literal reading there is that they eat the salt of the palace. What they were saying, they were actually on friendly terms with, the people in the palace. They ate the salt of the palace. Covenants were generally confirmed by sacrificial meals, and salt was always present. And so the significance of the salt was not just to add flavor, but to show that it was an everlasting covenant and there was a covenant of friendship. And so, in closing, we can see once again the wonderful application in our covenant. We already saw how there was a covenant meal in the new covenant, where Jesus chooses the Passover meal to introduce his new covenant, where he uses this emblem and gives new significance to the cup to say it represents his blood. But it is also a covenant of friendship. Jesus saying he's our friends. Isn't that amazing? Ken mentioned about the fact that, it also speaks in the Bible of us being the wife of Jesus, the bride. And that is a covenant of equality as well. So even though God is the greater party and there's no equal, yet he refers to us in these terms as a bride, as a wife, as a friend, when he doesn't need to. He gives us more than we deserve. And so when Jesus shares this covenant meal, the Last Supper, with his disciples, listen to what he says. This is a covenant meal. He tells them, I'm establishing a new covenant in my blood. And he says, I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I've made known to you. Isn't that a wonderful thing to know? That Jesus has instituted this covenant of salt with us, a covenant that will never be revoked, but it's a covenant in which he says, we are no longer his servants, we are his friends, a covenant of friendship. Beautiful, huh? Amen, folks. I trust that you've learned something there and been blessed by it.